One of the biggest differences between the first century movement after Jesus, Yeshua, and what we see today in mainstream modern Christianity is how we have made dependents instead of disciples. If we have a child and we raise that child up and they are dependent, they're dependent upon us for shelter, for food, to live. And then ultimately we hope to one day teach them so that they can live on their own, so that they can move out, so they can have their own job, so they can bring in their own income, feed their own family, and shelter their own family, and teach their own children as we have taught them. But yet, if we saw a man who was never taught to be a man, never taught to leave his house to find a job and look after a wife, we would think there's something wrong with that picture. You see, today we have a group of believers who have not been taught how to be disciples and how to make disciples. They have been dependent upon the clergy, the pastors, and the leaders that they're spiritually leading, but yet they're not being led and taught on how to make disciples on their own. The question is, where does this all come from? It's all rooted, perhaps, in the Catholic clergy system of old, of ancient times, where people were kept uneducated in who they are in Christ and all the things that are available to them in Christ, so that they could not excel past the clergy, so that they could not be educated to see the errors and the traditions that they are actually learning, such as the indulgences and so forth. Ultimately, brothers and sisters, we need to take off the traditions of old, of how we think of it to be normal to be a Christian or a believer, because God is calling us back to the first century church, where we are teaching people how they can be people who baptize others, where they can be people who walk in spiritual gifts of healing, where they can be people who speak in tongues, interpret tongues, and prophesy, where they can be people who receive words of knowledge, where they can be people who use these gifts to make disciples and be a witness, to have living waters flow from them and blow the trumpets that His return is imminent. He is calling a people who is not going to just be coming to church as to an entertainment center, but coming to a fellowship, to be in communion and in fellowship with one another, but to be equipped so that they can actually go out and be who God called them to be. Ultimately, God is calling disciples. He's calling us to make disciples, not people who are just dependent upon us. Because ultimately what Yeshua did was He made 12 disciples. Not to just be dependent upon Him, because one day He would leave them and one day they would be on their own to make their own disciples. Yeshua also sent out 72 others who was discipled by Him, who were going and walking out what He taught them. Do you see how the model that He walked out was one that empowered people to be the believers into the identity that God called Him to be? And that is what God is calling you to not be just a dependent, but to be empowered. So will you take up that mantle, and will you make disciples? If this has blessed you, like this video, subscribe to this channel for more videos just like this one. And I want to say a special thank you to our partners who have made this teaching and every other teaching this month possible. Blessings and shalom.